Hello. So I'm making this video. It was kind of supposed to be a warm up to another video I'd wanted to make, but man, I'm feeling very tired right now, so I don't know if I'm gonna actually make another video after this one. And this one's probably gonna be a mess. It's just I don't know. I felt like on an impulse. I just wanted to try to make a video, just think out loud about these things. What I'm hoping to do is that I'll eventually delete this video and then I'll make a series of videos discussing this topic, which I think is the broad topic, which I think is really interesting, is just what is the underlying biological properties that make a person trans? Really, what makes a person trans? That's sort of what interests me very much. I don't think it's a simple answer. I think it's a complicated thing. So I'd love to just talk about it so I can hear what other people think. Yeah, so the point of this, I made this video was just to discuss some comments that I have on the biology behind being transgender. So to make this very clear, just to get my terminology straight, for the remainder of this video, I'm going to use the definition of transgender, where transgender is just a synonym for transsexuality. And I'm just doing this so that, because I know that some people don't like being called transsexual. But yeah, if I say something like transgenderism, it just means transsexuality, which has a much more specific definition than the word transgender has. So there's just kind of this ongoing debate. It's interesting debate about whether transgenderism is determined by your biology, where it's like the argument is that what makes you trans is if you have a misalignment between the biology of your brain and your body. For example, if you have a biologically male brain but a biologically female body, that makes you transgender. If you have a biologically female brain and a biologically male brain, that also makes you transgender. But if you have a biologically female brain, a biologically female body, then you're not transgender. So there's definitely like a few things. There's a lot of things you can say in response to that. But I know that a lot of people, varying perspectives, argue that this point of view is nonsense and that there's no such thing as being biologically transgender. People who say that tend to have like multiple views. The people I'm talking about mostly now are the people who believe that there's no biological basis to being transgender. Well, one thing I can say right now is that if the theory that I think some conservative people have, which is just that when you're born, like it's like your genitalia like just match what your brain is almost, or what your innate core gender identity is. So like if you're just born with a penis, right, then 1-to-1, like you must also have a male core gender identity. Same thing, if you're born with a vagina, then 1-to-1, you must also have a female core gender identity. As a result, they think that people who are cisgender men and cisgender women, they have core gender identities as men and women, and that people who are trans, well, they're critical of these people because they think that like a trans man still has a core identity as a female, and that a trans woman has a core identity as a male. So that argument, pretty much, I think it's nonsense. It doesn't make sense. If you study the biology behind biological sex, you'll realize very quickly that that just doesn't make any sense. Hopefully, I'll make a video about what biological sex is to explain that a bit better. But I think the two most reasonable, although probably incomplete theories, which I see like butt heads with each other. One theory is the view of biological determinism, which I described previously, which says that when you're born, your brain has a biological sex, and so does your body. So if you're biologically male in the brain and biologically female in the body, you're transgender. But yeah, I just explained this. That's the view of biological determinism. But then there's a second view, which comes out of feminism, I think. But also other people have this view, not necessarily feminists. where that's the view which argues against the notion that you have that there is such thing as a biologically male or a biologically female brain. Essentially, this view is that we're all blank slates, and we develop gender identities because of our socialization. So the reason why a person develops like a core male identity or a core female identity is because like the minute, like, and this is very true, like the minute when a child is born, they declare that it's a boy, the mother is going to treat that child as a boy. Like generally this informs the way that the mother interprets the child's behavior. Like if the child is crying, they interpret that as anger, and there's generally more efforts to try to toughen that child up by coddling that child less and encouraging that child to engage in rough and tumble play, things like that. And then conversely, if they declare that the child is a girl, if the child starts crying, people interpret that as being sad or being scared, and that the child is generally coddled more and discouraged from forms of rough and tumble play, which could get the child hurt, so on and so forth. So that's the idea that that the reason why gender identity develops is because of our socialization, and due to the neuroplasticity of the brain, theoretically anybody could develop a male or female gender identity. It could be changed at any point in your life. Okay, so that actually differs from what most like feminist, or I think some feminists have this idea. But so not to link this idea to feminism, but I think that these are the theory of biological determinism, which is the first one I mentioned, and then the second theory of blank slates. They're both really interesting perspectives, and there's truth to both of them. However, I think that neither one is complete, and you really have to view the formation of gender identity as an interaction between your biological predispositions and your socialization. So before we continue, I think a major complication when it comes to discussing the development of gender identity and therefore what causes a person to be trans is the very meaning behind the word gender identity. What does gender identity actually mean? So as far as I know, the concept of gender identity as this like core identity, it comes out of these theories of sexual acquisition, which are about how do children learn to be boys and girls. So according to theories of cognitive development, sexual identity forms due to the interactions between the child's cognitive predispositions and the culture around them. So that this theory of cognitive development, I think, is the most compelling theory, but it's not the only one out there. There's also the theory, the Freudian identification theory is actually kind of more similar to a biological determinism model. It's kind of funny because Freud was fucking cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. Not to disrespect Freud, I just think that some of his ideas are really out there, and it's like just they're kind of bizarre looking back on them to think about them. But yeah, so what Freud's theory about sexual acquisition was that people are just born with innate, you're born with an innate sense of whether you're biologically male or female. So like a boy just naturally will just naturally want to become a boy without any influence of socialization because he has a penis, and because his whole psyche is influenced by this fear of getting his penis cut off. Whereas girls are not born with penises, so their whole psyche does not have this component of fear of castration, which causes a fundamental difference between boys and girls and how they acquire sex roles. So it's kind of funny to think about it because I just think that that's such a like quack idea, but yeah. But ultimately, the theory of identification is that like gender identity is something that you're born with. It's an innate and stable concept. And then the other theory too, I think it's called social learning theory, and that's kind of like the opposite of that concept of gender identity being really stable and innate, where it's the idea that gender identity is something that you just learn. It's caused by your socialization, not because you're born with anything in particular. Which theoretically means that anybody could develop a male or female gender identity just given how they're socialized. So the reason why we have these three different theories, the Freudian identification, the social learning theory, and the cognitive development theory, the reason why these three theories exist, and we don't have a concrete answer, is because, well, you can't actually scientifically prove any one because it would be really unethical to do so. The way you would be able to prove this is if you just took like 1,000 kids and attempted to just randomly socialize them as boys and girls, and then see if they all stuck with the role that they were assigned, or if some of them deviated away from it. Obviously, that would be really unethical because you'd totally screw up the kids' development, which is why we have these different theories on this. So between all of them, the Freudian identification theory says that you're just born with a gender identity. You can't change it. It's just like, it's like written into your DNA. And then the social learning theory, where nothing's written into your DNA, you're a blank slate. And then the cognitive development theory, which argues that it's a combination of your biological predispositions and your socialization. I think cognitive development is definitely the most sensible one. It just makes the most sense out of the three of them. So in that sense, gender identity is influenced by a combination of biology and socialization. But the thing here is that the way that gender identity is discussed in these texts, it's generally a very broad concept of gender identity, where gender identity doesn't just like encompass something which would make sense being like this core biological property, where like gender identity encompasses like your identification with your biological sex, but also the identification with your assigned gender role. So I think like most sensibly, things that involve like gender behaviors and gender roles, gender norms, those things are most likely very like either entirely or just really heavily determined by your socialization. They're determined by culture. The things like gender roles change. Like if you go across the globe, you're gonna find totally different gender roles over there. Although you might see some similarities just due to globalization of culture. But like historically, there have always just been different gender roles, different gender norms across cultures. So it only makes sense that these would change. These would change when you go to a different culture. But on the other hand, I think that the concept of a core gender identity, which I've heard before, core gender identity would just refer to your satisfaction or distress over the assigned sex that you had at birth. I've heard that phrase before, but I think like really like we just got it really precise. It's really just your contentment with your biological sex. And now that sounds like something that is probably more of a core property that's heavily influenced by some sort of biological factor. But the problem is that how do you, like, I don't think there have really been any studies that assess this to try to determine if there really is I don't think there have been any studies that have been on this sense of core gender identity to determine what causes a sense of core gender identity. Instead, at best, you get some studies on gender identity where it's a broader concept that encompasses core gender identity, but also your relationship to gender norms and gender behaviors. But even broader than that, a lot of times studies have not been done on gender identity. They're done on gender behaviors or gender roles as a proxy for gender identity. So, anyways, the thing is that let's just say we have an experiment. Like, you have a person, like, if you can imagine, there's like a desert island, and the pregnant mother is like on this plane flying above the desert island. She just gives birth to the baby, and the baby just falls off and lands on the desert island. Then the plane takes off. This desert island is like filled with food and water, so the kid lives, but grows up in complete isolation from other human beings. So in that situation, would that person develop a feeling of sex dysphoria? In other words, would this person have this core gender identity to them where they could have like just without any influence of socialization somehow develop like either contentment or dysphoria with their biological sex? So some studies on this would suggest that that person would not feel sex dysphoria at all, because what we find is that it appears that children are actually not aware of what biological sex really is until they're not born with that, because I think it's not until they're about 5 to 7 that children can accurately match like a penis with a boy and a vagina with a girl. When they're younger than that, kids don't realize that your genitalia determines whether you're a boy or a girl, or have any real notion of biological sex. Like most kids don't, it appears. But at the same time, kids seem to have some sense of gender identity by age 3, such that they can accurately identify that they are a boy or that they are a girl. What this may seem significant, but I'm not sure that this is very significant actually, because I think it just shows a very early stage of sex role acquisition or gender identity development, where at this really early stage, the kid is probably just parenting what their parents have told them, and they don't really understand the deeper meaning behind being a boy or a girl. I think that they could just as easily think that being a boy or a girl is like the same thing as wearing pants or a shirt. They don't really know that this has deeper implications. So I don't know. I'm not sure if they're actually aware that their gender identity is like the stable thing, that they can't change being a boy or a girl under normal circumstances, of course. But I mean, it's like when kids are very young, they don't really get what makes a person a boy or a girl, such that like if you have a boy and that boy puts on a dress, the kid actually believes that this boy has become a girl a lot of the time. So anyways, what this sums up to is that this would point to the very interesting finding, which means that people don't actually like have this innate concept of like biological sex, like knowing that like this innate understanding of knowing that you're female or male and whether that's correct or not, unless you interact with, like, it's society that will teach you that. But the thing that I would argue is that these studies on children are actually not sufficient, because the physical differences between prepubescent children are so slight. Kids place more weight on like the length of their hair than things like genitalia or any physical differences, and physical differences really aren't there at all. Like a little girl can be taller than a little boy, a little girl can be stronger than a little boy, because the differences at the prepubescent age are very minimal. So a better but very unethical experiment would be to see whether a young adult who has already gone through puberty, left on this desert island, would have some feeling of an innate feeling of wrongness with their biological sex. So is that possible? I kind of suspect, I mean, this is just my suspicion, I don't know if it's true or not because I haven't experimented on this. Obviously, I'm not some evil dictator who raises children on desert islands or anything. But I suspect that, like, even in total isolation, there would, like, my hypothesis is that even in total isolation, people do have this core sense of gender identity, such that there would still be some people who would feel some form of sex dysphoria, where they'd have this like mysterious sort of feeling that something is wrong with their body, but they wouldn't really be able to put a finger on it because they wouldn't have language to describe what that is. That's totally hypothetical, and it could be completely wrong. So it's just all that's really a thought experiment. It's kind of stupid, honestly, to waste brain energy on it, because nobody is raised in isolation. That's not what being a human being on this earth is about. Everybody is raised in a society. Now, if you have that desert island and populate it with some people, maybe now the desert island is populated with other people, but on this desert island, there's no such thing as gender roles, so there's no distinction between men and women. Everybody's just called humans, and everybody's called they, them pronouns. You can wear whatever the fuck you want. You can do whatever the fuck you want. It doesn't matter. There's no rules regarding that. Well, I definitely think that some people on that island would still be sex dysphoric, because there would be this core sense of this core gender identity, feeling whether your biological sex is right or wrong. Because the people on this island would still see the sexual dimorphism amongst the other people living on the island, right? So some people will have probably a very small proportion of the total population, but some people would still feel that they were born the wrong sex. So I think that because of that, this sort of idea underlies a more core concept of gender identity. And this is something that I really wish there was more like data and research into, to determine whether this is a property that is truly biologically determined. Personally, I think that this core gender identity, it must either be a biological reality or it's something that is developmentally determined. So now I'll describe the theory of developmental determinism. So this is a theory written by the infamous John Money. If you don't know John Money, he's infamous because he was involved in the David Reimer case, where you can look that up if you're interested in it. It's a mishandled case involving a boy whose circumcision was botched. So they attempted to raise him as a girl, and John Money, of all people, said that this was a case of successful reassignment of this child from male to female. But it came out later that this boy who they tried to raise as a girl was not happy being raised as a girl. Tried to go live as a man by the time of reaching adulthood. And then it ended up in tragedy. The whole case was very mishandled, clearly. Anyways, John Money is also very famous in the field of sexology, and he has this theory of developmental determinism regarding gender identity. I believe also sexual orientation. It's the same theory. So the developmental determinism is broken into like three stages, or three components: nature, critical period, and nurture. So nature refers to the biological predispositions that person is born with. Critical period refers to a critical period in your development, and that's during this period that this combination of biological predispositions, nature, and socialization, nurture, there's an interaction between these two, and your gender identity is pretty much set in stone after this critical period. So I think that of all the theories that exist, this is probably the simplest one, the most elegant, and probably most accurate theory of all the popular theories I've seen regarding gender identity. So I think that there is very likely a critical period in your development. It's probably, there might be actually two separate periods, one being your childhood and the second being your the adolescence where you go through puberty. But definitely some period, so such that by the time you're an adult, your gender identity is pretty much fixed at that point. And it might be possible to change it, but it just is like at that point, by the time you're an adult, it's just very difficult or even impossible to try to reverse it since you've already gone through this critical period. And then the same principle applies to sexual orientation too. I know that for some people, gender identity is fluid, sexuality is fluid, but I think that for a lot of people, after you go through this critical period, you can't reverse it. So in any case, it would be unethical to try to tell adults who are trans or are homosexual or are bisexual. It would be unethical to try to tell these people that they can reverse it, because it's either totally impossible or it's practically impossible, where it's just too difficult and not worth the time and effort to try to reverse it. Better to just live your life. So ultimately, yeah, so I guess in the end, long story short here, I think that sexual orientation and gender identity should be conceptualized essentially the same way, because one thing in particular that strikes me in much of the readings that I've read is that three concepts are often grouped together: your gender, your sexual orientation, and your sex. And they're grouped together because theorists believe that these three things develop similarly. So sex here refers to your anatomic sex, and we know for a fact that anatomic sex is biologically determined. Like, yeah, there might be some influence, some environmental influences at certain critical periods can screw around with that, but really, it's heavily, very heavily influenced by your biology. That determines your anatomic sex, and it's not like you can move to a stressful or less stressful environment and your anatomic sex will change. That very likely you won't see that happen. The other one is sexual orientation, which has also been studied more than core gender identity, at least. So there's evidence too that sexual orientation is also biologically determined. There's been research on genes and the hypothalamus, like hormones, shit like that. So it appears that sexual orientation okay, maybe it's not biologically determined, but it's at least biologically influenced. There's some sort of genetic influence in there. And then, so between these two things, I think you have sexual orientation, which is something that is probably has biologically influenced, but also influenced by socialization. And then you have anatomic sex, which is almost entirely biologically determined. Between these two things, core gender identity probably lies like between them. So as a result, like you would have to be consistent across these three things when you conceptualize the core gender identity. So I think that as a result, it's only sensible to say that core gender identity, it's something between sexual orientation and anatomic sex, such that core gender identity is either biologically determined or heavily, or it's biologically influenced, most likely. And it's influenced similar to sexual orientation, such that after you pass through a critical period, you can't really change it. Or just becomes very difficult to do so and not really worth the time. Yeah, that's kind of my point here. I think that it gets very hypocritical when people, I guess I know some people who think this way. They think that like anatomic sex is a innate thing, biological reality. Sexual orientation, also an innate thing. It's a biological reality. But gender identity somehow is not a biological reality. So if you're talking about gender identity in like a very broad sense, like if you get into like queer theory and shit, and you think like gender is a oppressive social construct, it's not real. This is a valid idea. I think that that's actually a very important thing to discuss. But if we're talking about people who are like transgender because they just don't agree, like politically they don't agree with the concept of there being male and female gender roles. So if we talk about that, then that's probably not something that's biologically determined. But if we're talking about people who are transgender or are transsexual because they feel that their anatomic sex was wrong, that's something that is more like, that is what I would refer to as your core gender identity, and that's comparable to your sexual orientation, where both of these things should be conceptualized as either biological realities or things that are influenced by your biology, and you cannot change them because they're developmentally determined. Yeah, so wow, I've almost spoken for 30 minutes on this, so I guess not bad. I think I kind of rambled off, but anyways, I'm really interested in making some more videos to discuss like the nitty-gritty behind this, and sort of I'd like to hopefully remake this video where I can provide a lot more information, get really into it. I want to make videos about what makes your anatomic sex, what makes your gender identity, is there such thing as male and female brains, and ultimately have the crux come down to what is the most, like, what's the theory behind core gender identity, for lack of a better term. Yeah, because I've just been trying to think this over. I used to really, like pretty recently, when I learned about brain organization theory, I was really like convinced of it. And I thought like, wow, okay, this is absolutely true. This has got to be it. It's got to be that your like biology just totally determines whether you're trans or not. But after reading into it, I'm realizing that the science behind this is not totally robust, and it's more complicated than like your biology just has this set in stone from the time you're born. But in any case, I think it would be really interesting to just talk about this, because I know other people are interested in this too. And it also it informs the way that we think about what being trans is. But long story short, if you don't care to hear about that, I think that if you are like a progressive person, you have the understanding that you being gay or being bi is this innate thing that a person can't change, then it's only hypocritical if you don't think the same thing about trans people. It truly is, truly is. Yeah, thought this thing it would be interesting to talk more about that. Kind of just keep talking for no reason now. That's all I gotta say. I'll make other videos hopefully soon. Take care now. Bye.